Hello, and welcome to Evolution of the Fight, a conversation between community organizers about Philadelphia's social justice movements, inspired by Louis Messiah's film, A is for Anarchist, B is for Brown. You are listening to WPPM 106.5 FM Philly Cam Radio and watching Philly Cam TV. This panel discussion is part of Philly Cam's Philadelphia Stories 20th Anniversary Retrospective. Philadelphia Stories was a program that chronicled our city's rich cultural fabric and imagined futures through the eyes of independent filmmakers and community storytellers. It introduced all genres of filmmaking and gave many filmmakers their first broadcast premiere. Now, 20 years later, Philly Cam, with generous support from the Independence Public Media Foundation, is providing Philadelphians the opportunity to revisit these memorable independent films. This panel is part of that exploration. How do we tell Philly stories? Messiah's film, A is for Anarchist, B is for Brown, airing tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, explores the history of activism in Philadelphia and the roots that are long and deep, from struggles against slavery to contemporary struggles against racism, criminalization of youth, and around educational issues. Anchored by the themes explored in Louis Messiah's film, this conversation amongst community organizers whose work spans from the early 2000s to today, and I would even say pre-early 2000s, connects and reflects upon social justice movement building over the past 2 decades. And I'm very pleased to welcome our panel. I'll first say my name is Amadi Braxton. I'm moderating today, and I'm one of the people in the film whom you may recognize. But I'd like to introduce the panelists for today, including another person who is in the film, Toy Nguyen, pronouns he and him. Toy is CEO of CMAC for the past 17 years and is a first-generation Vietnamese refugee and longtime community organizer and advocate for civil and human rights of marginalized communities. Toy has worked on advocacy, community organizing, and development projects in many communities across the United States and in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, Eastern Europe, Central America, and Mexico. Toy co-founded the Philadelphia Brown Collective, which is one of the organizations featured in the film. I next want to introduce Pep Marie. Pep Marie, pronouns they and them. Pep is proud to be Black, queer, and Philly born. They joined the movement family in high school and remained committed as an adult to spaces that center Black, brown, and working class young people, especially when it comes to transforming our schools. Pep is the coalition coordinator for the Our City, Our Schools Coalition. Welcome. And I'd like to next introduce Christopher Rogers. Christopher R. Rogers is an educator and cultural worker from Chester, PA. He serves as public programs director for the Paul Robeson House and Museum, where he has volunteered since 2015. Additionally, he's currently a doctoral student within the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, where he studies neighborhood storytelling practices in West Philadelphia. He serves on the National Steering Committee for Black Lives Matter at School, supporting movements for racial justice in K through 16 education. And he's representing Police Free Penn. Important to note that. And finally, our final panelist is Grace Phan, she, her pronouns, of Asian Americans United. Grace Phan is Taiwanese American and is youth programs coordinator at Asian Americans United. She's passionate about learning with and working with Asian American youth who will transform our futures. Welcome, Grace. So really delighted to have you all here. And, you know, in watching the film, as I alluded to earlier, you know, seeing myself in there was fun, and seeing Toy but thinking about how these struggles that were depicted in the film that were taking place back then in the early 2000s have evolved to today. I'm really excited at the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I wanted to start with you, Toy, because the Brown Collective, the Philadelphia Brown Collective, was one of the organizations featured in the documentary. And I wanted to ask you to talk about your purpose and intention for founding the Philadelphia Brown Collective, and how, in watching the film now, how you reflect on what that group was trying to do and what your purpose was in forming it initially.
It's really lovely to see you, Amadi. Watching the film, seeing you and all my other comrades was really wonderful. But the the purpose of the Brown Collective was to galvanize the progressive circles in Philadelphia. And as you know, Philadelphia has back then was even smaller, a fairly small progressive radical circle. And I wanted to have a collective that was truly led by BIPOC leadership, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and white allies that were really truly anti-racist and working on issues that were grounded in communities. And I do want to say one thing though. In the film, you had said that Toy thought the Brown Collective name, the group in Seattle, was really cool. It goes much deeper than that, right? Because I actually had a relationship with the Brown Collective in Seattle, which had been a big part of Black and Brown organizing in Seattle during the battle in Seattle. So Hop Hopkins was a good friend and comrade. So when I came back to Philly, I really wanted to do something very similar. And I had Hop's blessing. So when you, Jackie, and I and Kate Sorensen met, time and time again in cafes and bars to really think about how do we expand this. I think the Brown Collective became a kind of a natural name. And to me, it was key to have you, Amadi, as one of the co-conspirators, right? And Jackie, and Jackie remains one of my most fierce white ally that we have, right? And the Brown Collective, which is featured in the film, included so many fierce young activists then, right? So we have Kim Mock, we had Nijmi Jurenko, we had Solly, we had Louis Ortiz, Becca Warner. That's just to name a few, right? They're probably not. They'll probably be offended if I call them young now, but so what? But behind the scene too, right? It's very important to understand that there were folks that were not part of the Brown Collective, but supported our work in grounding struggle, not just direct action, not just about civil disobedience and taking over streets, taking over buildings as something sexy, but something that was grounded in community organizing principles that talked about poverty, that talks about police brutality, talks about white supremacy as the matrix that we're fighting against. Mm-hmm. So some of the folks that were very supportive were like Jody Dodd, Judy Claude, Christy Balka, Bob Brandt, Michael Simmons, Kate Sorensen, Maddie Hart, Carol Rogers, Ed Nakawadase, Joyce Miller, Craig Shimabukuro, Julie Davis, Susan Phillips. Again, just to name a few, but there were tons of people behind the scene. And I want to make sure that we always acknowledge, our comrades, right? Always. Mm-hmm. And, to me, the film was coming off a decade long of, me cutting my teeth as an organizer with Asian Americans United in Philadelphia and the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence in New York City. And I was organizing in the context of neo-fascism, right? Philadelphia was under the leadership of Ed Rendell, right? Neo-fascist. And then when I was in New York, I was organizing against Rudy Giuliani. And we all know how that turned out, right? So these were, when I say neo-fascist, I'm being absolutely serious. And it was funny because Louis Messiah interviewed me in August of 2001. And for context, that was a month before 9/11, right? So, and and George W. and Dick Cheney, and they use 9/11 to really, further erode, dissent in this country, organizing in this country, and had a really chilling effect on the movement. I was actually in Eastern Europe when 9/11 happened, and on assignment to work with Roma communities there. So, watching the film now, I never really put those things together, but there was a period, many years after 9/11, where dissent and organizing was shut down. I think it's slowly growing again. And, couldn't be happier with like Black Lives Matter movement, right? That really has injected progressive radical action again into our movement. Sorry that took so long.
That's okay. I appreciate you naming names and giving props where props are due. And, the point you're making about dissent and neo-fascism and where we find ourselves today. I mean, a lot of the film was shot in the melee of the 2000 RNC, the Republican National Convention that took place in Philadelphia. And we had, part of what Brown Collective and other groups were doing were protesting against the RNC being here and against our local city government for allowing them to be here, inviting them here. And there was a huge police crackdown that was like unprecedented for us, I think, at the time. And that was something that was being, Philly was kind of a model, and it was replicated in other of these mobilizations that were happening around the country. And that was part of the strategy of quelling dissent. And that was kind of foreshadowing or prefiguring what we see now, right, in terms of repression and the march toward fascism. That I think that there are forces that want us to continue on that path. So really important context.
Amadi, could I add to that?
Yeah.
There were 5 comrades during the RNC that we worked with that were arrested, and their bail was set at $1 million apiece. That was unheard of for acts of civil disobedience. Mm-hmm. So Mahdi is absolutely correct in saying that Philadelphia was the model that this white supremacist run country used for all the sort of quelling of dissent afterwards.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, absolutely. I want to open up the conversation a little bit to just, part of what the film is looking at is how do we work across difference? How do we work across racial difference? How do we work in coalition with one another? And we hear, not only folks in the Brown Collective, but also folks in ACT UP in the film talking about the challenge of, working particularly across race, I think was what was lifted up mostly in the film. But, I think generally when you're talking about intersectional movements and working in community-based movements, and how do you bridge, professional full-time activists orientation with community orientation? How do you bridge racial divides and all of these things that, the society and the oppressors would have keep us separated from each other? How do you bridge those, right, to work in coalition? And so, John Bell of ACT UP, may he rest in peace, talked about how, trust building is a necessary part of the process. For example, I think a younger version of me talked about challenges we were coming up with in terms of working with white activists who were more comfortable with, directly confronting the police than people of color, Black and brown people were, things like that. So I want to turn to you, Pep, because I know your work is really about this coalition around transforming our schools. And, talk a little bit about your work first, but then also if you could talk about how, how you navigate the challenges of working in coalition, working with a range of different organizations who have different particular interests, as well as a range of different folks within those organizations and within the movement to transform the schools.
Thank you, and so appreciative to be here with you all. So my name is Pep. I am the coalition coordinator for our City Our Schools, and we're a coalition of about 25 to 30 organizations that work on different ed justice issues. And those represent youth organizations, caregiver organizations, educators, and then also some concerned community members who work on cross issues. And so, what we do is come together monthly and talk about the things that are happening in our schools and the different campaigns that the organizations are leading. And we just offer space for people to cross strategize. And right now, we have a platform that represents about 13 different campaigns that are led by our member orgs. And I guess I'll get into some more about the work in this question because I very much appreciate the question. Because it's not easy to hold a multiracial, multi-generational, multi many identities space. And I think it was a question from the first day of this job when I started in 2019. And I want to say the biggest joy is seeing Black and Brown, especially young people, queer people, working class people, step into their leadership in this space that really is like a microcosm of society in a lot of ways, but it's also the biggest challenge. And I think it's what you were naming, Amity, about the ways those structures show up in our work, and in the movement itself that can be really divisive. And so when I came in 2019, it was a year after Our City, Our Schools had won the campaign to abolish the School Reform Commission. And that was a very diverse collection of organizations. There were folks from labor, there were educators, there were students, there were folks representing immigrants. And it was really powerful. And everyone attests that that win was because of that grouping of people. But when I came in 2019, the space was extremely white. And I was pretty confused. It was a lot of retired teachers and then some professors. And so I was like, all right, my work started in Philly Student Union. I know that this work has to, have young Black and Brown people leading this work. And we don't have anyone here. We didn't really have a lot of school-based people. And I think everyone recognized that as an issue, which was a good thing that I didn't have to convince people. Um, and so I did a bunch of one-on-ones with groups that had left, groups that I thought maybe could be a good fit for the space, and asked them, like, if there was this coalition for ed justice, what would you want it to be? And how could it support your work? And a lot of people said that, they had bad experiences with coalitions in the past where it was really top down or they felt tokenized. And so we talked about ways that OCOS could exist a little bit differently. And so part of that was moving to a structure where we don't have one campaign, we support the campaigns of our members. And another request was that we infuse leadership development into our work, that we don't have enough Black and Brown young people in this work, and we have to make sure we're doing that, and having intentional time. I'm just gonna grab some water.
Mm-hmm.
So once I met with those groups, I made a commitment. I was like, come to this retreat. I promise I'll hold what you're sharing in the space and we'll decide what we want this to be. And so we all came together and came up with a grounding statement that essentially calls on the school district to center the leadership of Black and Brown young people, their school communities, their families. So once we said okay, that's what we want from the district, it allowed us to be well, we need that to be what we're doing in our own space. And that really, for me, is the work of defining what the relationships are. Mm-hmm. And I think I don't remember exactly who, I don't have the direct quote, but someone was just talking about this process of seeing yourself not just as an individual, but in the collective. And I think a lot of our orgs are I'm going to do it all. I'm going to do it all. And so this was an opportunity to be okay, you can do this bit, you can do that bit, but we all know what's going on and we're checking in. So folks were bought into that. And I think when COVID happened, it was so obvious that we had to have a pathway from people who were in schools to the folks who are supporters, but don't actually know what's going on in schools. And so when schools closed, we held a meeting and we heard from students, we heard from parents and teachers. And so other folks who had that white sense of urgency had somewhere to plug it into, not just move with what they thought should happen. And so I think a challenge is that you have a lot of people who are plugged in a lot of different ways, and their schedules are really different. So we try to like make responsive structures. So even if we can't all be in the room, like I'm checking in with everybody, or we're having a social event where we're chatting, so that we get all those perspectives. Because we really can't get much done when we don't know what the people on the ground need, which unfortunately like should go without saying, but that's just not the case. Any last bits? I think another two more challenges that I do want to name is like when the uprising happened in Philly, um, we saw the white urgency again, like people like, oh, what are we gonna do? What's the action? What's next? And all the Black organizers were like, I just want to talk to other Black organizers about what I'm going through. That, you know, we don't all agree. We all have really complex feelings about this. And so we created racial affinity caucuses, and there was a lot of pushback, which I actually didn't anticipate. And I think it was tied to like, oh yeah, like we're in coalition because we all need to be together. So why should we ever not be together? And I think that was like a really important moment of realizing that like not everybody has to be in every conversation. And I don't know if that was necessarily how people thought about multiracial or multi-identity organizing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, do you wanna step in, Chris?
Yeah, Chris, if you want to build on what Pep was sharing, thanks so much, Pep, because so much intentionality going into what you're doing in terms of relationship building and creating the space necessary for people to galvanize themselves, galvanize their power. Christopher, what do you want to add to this conversation about coalition and working across difference?
Yes, and thank you, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. I'm currently at the Paul Robeson House and Museum right now, and we're going through renovations. That's why my background is like this. But in terms of coalition building, and speaking in particular to the 2020 uprising, the Paul Robeson House and Museum, we just finished a project, a publication project called How We Stay Free, that was built on exactly what Pep mentioned in terms of where are the spaces for Black organizers, particularly in Philadelphia, folks who have committed themselves to movement, to share space and reflect and share lessons. And what I loved about the film is that you got to see that work in action. And I think like the inheritance of the many people that were a part of that film and the institutions that they built. Like I'm from Chester, and I remember like my first time at Wood and Shoe Books. And being like, okay, maybe it's too many white people, but at the same time, it's a rich library, and the discussions and spaces for dialogue that happened there was so beautiful. So I really wanted to like affirm that coalition building is so important. It's not always a comfortable space, but we must create those spaces. And I'm happy that this project that we just finished called How We Stay Free is all about like how that work happened in the uprising, featuring like the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, featuring the Black Philly Radical Collective, featuring Philadelphia Housing Action, and the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, and so many others. So I'm just so excited by that, and thinking of how that coalition work is so important to just creating that healthy space within our movements, right?
Mm-hmm.
We deal with enough conflict as is. We need space to build relationships, like healthy relationships with folks.
Mm. Well, I want to stay on you, Christopher, because a lot of what was featured in the film was really around the movement at that stage of it, around ending criminalization of Black and Brown communities in particular, but of many communities. And also, criminal justice reform, and a lot of issues around privatization of prisons. That was a lot of what we were coming together around, in addition to education, quality education funding access. But talk about your work with Police Free Penn, and what seeing the film made you think about, and as you think about the work that you're doing today, what the film made you reflect on, or what came up for you in seeing kind of the movement then 20 years ago, and now?
Yes, thank you for that invitation. And Police Free Penn is an assembly, abolitionist assembly, we call it at the University of Pennsylvania, that is comprised of undergraduate students, graduate students, staff, faculty, alumni, and all those who are seeking to really transform the way we understand community safety at the University of Pennsylvania, but also because of how embedded and um, exploitative, just to be honest, of University of Pennsylvania is of the rest of the city, we know we must be connected to other movements. So Police Free Penn started in June of 2020 as a way to really just follow along in the blueprint that the Black Philly Radical Collective has set with their visionary 13 demands. The platform is "In the War on Black Philadelphia Now," and what we realized is that the institution of the University of Pennsylvania, this $20 billion institution that is right in West Philadelphia, um, um, it it also has the largest private police force in the state of Pennsylvania, right? In terms of the power and the concentrated wealth and resources that are there, the sort of space of influence, it's something that has to be tapped into in order to really transform the conditions across the city. So the question that we asked ourselves as those associated with that institution was, what is our responsibility to the local led organizing, right? What is our responsibility to Philadelphia schools, right? Penn, Drexel, all our universities need to be paying pilots, right? We can't just sort of give these sort of small gifts at the whim of whenever the sort of board of trustees decide. They need to be accountable in terms of making sure that the extraordinary wealth that they are hoarding is makes its way and is redistributed to take care of those who are marginalized, those who are exploited and oppressed.
Can you, Chris, let me just interrupt for a second. Can you just explain for those in the audience who might not know pilots, what does pilots mean? What does it stand for?
Yes, I thank you for that. And so pilots, payments in lieu of taxes. Because University of Pennsylvania is labeled a nonprofit as a taxable, as a tax sort of thing, they don't have to pay property taxes on their sort of properties. If they were treated as a for-profit corporation, and it's not to say that they don't profit, right? You don't get $20 billion without, finding ways to profit. But let's say that payments in lieu of taxes, if they paid property taxes, they would have to give the city of Philadelphia $250 million per year based on their assets. They don't have to because they're labeled a nonprofit. And without those resources, we see our schools starve. We just saw that report yesterday about the lead across Philadelphia schools, right? And we can think about all the other city resources that could be supported if they were to pay taxes. Like, for example, just last year in the midst of the COVID pandemic, Penn raked in another $5.6 billion, right? They make $100 million quote unquote gift to the schools that is supposed to happen over 10 years. And you're just saying these numbers don't add up. So our responsibility, what we think about at Police Free Penn in terms of abolition, is not just about, ending police brutality or police abuses or, closing prisons. It's the presence of life affirming institutions. And the work that we go about doing that is being integrated and being accountable to local housing struggles. Right now we have a whole campaign around the University City townhomes that's happening. The developer of the owner of that property is looking to sort of cash out and basically evict 76 Black working class families to sell that property to create a new high rise in University City for about $80 to $100 million. And we're we have to put people before profits. That's part of an abolitionist agenda. So our work has been about recognizing our responsibility, being this institution in the city. And yes, we have a lot of transient people who come through Penn and kind of are aware, but how do we bring them into our movements as we talk about that coalition building? How do we find space for that? So thank you.
Wow, thank you. As you're talking and naming abolition, I'm thinking about how a lot of my consciousness, and I think I can speak for other Brown Collective members at the time, our consciousness was being shaped at that time by the work of Critical Resistance, who was really was the first place that I really heard naming prison abolition as a demand. And it seemed like a very radical thing then. And now we see abolition, defunding the police, those kinds of demands now taking on more mainstream, being more part of the mainstream conversation today. And so you're kind of I was just noting the evolution from that perspective. I want to shift to Grace, who hasn't gotten a chance to speak yet. And I know you want to speak to this, but I also just want to invite you into, if you could, talk about too the role of that multi-generational organizing and how the work gets passed on, right, to different generations. And I know, hearing you speak previously, I know that you were a student who was an organizer, or who became radicalized and became an organizer. And now you're in this role where you're training other young people. So speak to that, but also you can speak to some of the issues that Christopher was raising. I know you wanted to address.
Yeah, there's so much to respond to.
Take it away. Do what you want with it.
Yeah, well, I don't even know where to start. So just to remind folks, I'm Grace. I use she, her pronouns. I am the youth programs coordinator at Asian Americans United. We work with really incredible Asian American youth who are high school age, trying to build Asian American youth power, and kind of also like foster a political consciousness in Asian American youth. And one thing that I did want to say is wanted to give an affirmation to PEP for the work that they do, because we're part of OCOS, and actually the intentionality that they put into OCOS allows us to build a more multi-ethnic, multiracial work in our space, because we're able to connect with other orgs. So just want to raise up that. That was something that I was feeling grateful for, and just hearing their story and them talk, I was just feeling thankful. And something that we do at AU, our focus is really historically we've kind of focused on our community, on building political consciousness in Asian American folks and folks of the Asian diaspora. So because historically, there haven't been a ton of spaces, but over time there have grown to be a lot of spaces, which is beautiful. But yeah, we've kind of been inward facing a lot of times. And so being plugged into spaces like OCOS has allowed us to expand and to build relationships with other brown and Black orgs. And that's something that we've been doing actually more recently. That's been really great. But in terms of multi-generational kind of work, it's something that we really focus on at AU, just making sure that our community is constantly in communication with each other, that we're learning from each other. I think, I actually didn't grow up in Philly. So I grew up in Maine, totally different context. I had no political elders growing up. And so one of the thing that I'm actually most thankful for through AU is having those political elders and being able to see folks and learn from folks who are older than me, but also learn from folks who are younger than me. I'm constantly learning from our youth. And historically, AU has structured our programs such that not only are our staff learning from youth and our elders in communication with youth, but also our youth are teaching children, and our youth are in communication with parents, and parents are talking to elders, and we have you know, all of these intentional like structures in place so that we're always telling stories and always, you know, building connections in different ways. So that's been really amazing to witness. Obviously, it's been harder in COVID, but yeah, let's just even in COVID, trying to build ways to share stories and to share histories. But yeah, I think that's something that I was thinking about with just the multi-generational aspect. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that AAU does so well, and I think it's something that a lot of other movement spaces could learn from, on how we do that intergenerational work. I wanted to open it up to you, Toy, because I know you had something you wanted to add to the conversation.
Yeah, so I'm not gonna mince. I'm not as nice as Chris probably, so I'm gonna just call Penn and other universities and colleges in the country in Philadelphia a sham. There's it's not a nonprofit, right? So every property that they gobble up is tax revenue loss to the city of Philadelphia. And what really disturbs me is there's not a single politician in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania willing to call out Penn or Drexel or Temple. Those are I mean, they're in the same stream, but not to the extreme of Penn. So I want to say that, and the struggle that you're dealing with, Chris. I think I really appreciate you, Pep, and Grace's comments so far, because they are. I don't want to say this so that it's demoralizing, but we were dealing with Brown Collective was supporting Penn students. There were protests, there were hunger strikes, there were civil disobedience on campus at Penn, in 2001, in 2000, and so we were doing support work for them as well. So the struggle, continues. It's change, and that's because really capitalism has pivoted so many times in the last 20 years to kind of like make itself relevant and make it the primary ideology in this country, right? We are also in the midst of the most emboldened white supremacist period in a long time, right? And to me, capitalism and white supremacy, white male patriarchy are all kind of wrapped up in one, right? And so when you guys talk about being rooted in community, I love it, right? Because how my understanding has deepened over the last 20, 30 years is that when people talk about radical, right, they're talking about banner waving, marching, and getting, beat up by the police, getting arrested by the police. Well, I'm not into that, right? I can organize those actions, blindfolded, but I'm not interested in that. What's the most radical thing that I've ever done? I was asked this question about 10 years ago. I was giving a talk to Penn students, actually, and some of the students had researched, Googled, my work, and she asked me, what's the most radical thing that you've ever done, Toy? And I said, it was an easy question: putting food on the table for families that could not put food on the table. So radical really just means the root, right? The root cause of things. So if you really want to get deep, it's not just about civil disobedience or direct action or protest. Those are all parts of a larger toolbox that we all need to have as organizers and activists and advocates. But they're just not one thing. So I'm just so inspired by all three of Grace, Chris, and Pep's work, because to me that's what radical organizing, radical change is about, when you really get to the root of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you described it as part of the toolbox, you know, and I'm thinking about the different, the different organizations that have grown out of the work that has been ongoing work, right? The film depicts a moment 20 years ago, around 20 years ago, but we were doing work on the shoulders of those who came before us. But, you know, I think it was Pep, you alluded to student union, Nijmi Zarenko was one of the people who helped shepherd that forward, along with Eric Braxton. And, I just actually right before this panel, I was at the courthouse for a hearing for a family member of mine who is incarcerated right now. And thankfully recently connected with an organization, Youth Art Self-Empowerment Project, which is, doing that work of putting food on my table in the form of supporting and helping me navigate and figure out advocacy strategies for my loved one in jail, and how to navigate the system, right, which is life-saving information and support for me, while also letting me know that there's movement stuff happening. There was a caravan this past Saturday on State Road protesting conditions in the prison for those incarcerated right now, particularly in COVID and with lack of staff at the prisons. And there's a lot of things happening where people are being mistreated. I believe over 10 people died in prison over the past year because of what's the conditions there. And, in the film 20 years ago, we saw an ACT UP protest where people were protesting conditions in prison where people were dying who had chronic health issues. So the struggles continue, but they remain the same, but also, that needed work of both the putting the food on the table and building that direct action, the layers of direct action that need to happen, the advocacy that needs to happen, all of that is a part of the toolbox. So before we started this panel and went on air, a few of you said, we want to ask you guys questions because we were in the film and part of Brown Collective that was depicted in the film. So if there's anything that you want to ask, you can feel free, as opposed to having questions directed by me only. I'll just say another thing that was interesting about the film too, timing wise, and just seeing the evolution and the different stages of the struggle. When at the time the film was, the SRC had just kind of come into formation, right? The state passed a law signed by the governor at the time to abolish our local school board and to take over our schools. And you saw, some of the fight depicted in the film around, us going door to door to let people know about this private company that they were considering allowing to come in, Edison, to take over running some of the schools. And now we're here where we finally got rid of the SRC. There's still more work to be done to make the school board what we need it to be. But, just talk about the evolution of these struggles and how do you, were you heartened or dismayed by, we still have so much to do? They were working on those struggles back then. How did you feel about the work that you're doing now, and how far we've come, perhaps, or how far you feel we need to go?
I thank you for that framing. One thing I'll say, so I'm from Chester. I was in Chester Upland at the time of this movie's filming. And we have been under state control since '94. And they had given our entire schools to Edison. So at that time when they are trying to, this thing's happening in Philadelphia, it's a direct connection. And that project failed in Chester as well. But the question that I'm interested in hearing from you all is seeing, I think one of the things that comes up in our movements now, right, is the idea of burnout or activist burnout or organizational burnout. Sometimes organizations need to sort of like go away and for new organizations to be born. And just hearing from you all today, how you were both sort of like resolute in your principles and in the work that you do, I would love to hear about that evolution. And were there periods in your life, your activist life, that you felt like, I got to take a step back? And what were the factors in that? And what was the factors of the renewal of that too, for yourselves, but also like for our movements?
So Chris, I'll take that one on. I'll share a very funny story about. I'm in my 17th year at CMAC as the CEO, and I was told by a colleague of mine about 4 years ago that she said she didn't say this to me directly, but she said it in my presence when we were having lunch with a bunch of people. She said, executive directors need to step down after 7 years because executive directors lose they lose, they just stop having good ideas. So at that point, I was 14 years in. So I said, well, you know what? I've lost ideas twice. I'm going for a third time. To answer your question, though, I really do think that, every year, there are a couple of days, sometimes a week long, where I question what I do. Is it enough? What have I accomplished? And I think it's a really good exercise for all of us to go through. And obviously, I think I mentor my, younger activists to take better care of themselves. Like, I know all the principles of it. I just don't do it myself as much as I should, right? I want to do more, obviously. But I think, I think just to be grounded in community really keeps you kind of fresh, right? So 20 years ago, we were fighting the prison industrial complex. That prison industrial complex still remains. It's called something different now. They're trying to figure out new ways to make money from criminalizing, poor people and people of color, right? To me, the nonprofit sector, which I'm a part of, is also an industrial complex, right? It is the buffer between true revolutionary change and piecemeal change, right? So Penn can give you $100 million and think that they did something, but all the while they're making $6 billion in that year. So I think studying helps, having good friends, a family that understands you, that you can retreat to, having a hobby is really important, right? I mean, it sounds ridiculous, right? But it is. And I think it's okay to question yourself, but also remind yourself that, I do this all the time. I go through a whole year and I said, man, I did do nothing in 2021. And I do an exercise where I just look at my calendar, right, for that year. And I'm like, holy shnikey, wow. So I think you have to kind of remind yourself, because, a lot of your work, the work that we all do here is for the most part unacknowledged, right? And so only those closest to you will acknowledge you, so you have to derive passion and motivation from more than just, outside. You have to figure this out internally. And I'll just say one last thing. So I've been in this fight for 30 something years now. Amadi and I have been, right? And then I think of someone like Yuri Kochiyama, right? A mentor of mine who was in the struggle for 60, 70 years. So I'm not even halfway there, right? So who am I to say that I'm done, I'm ready to retire? No, I really think about, Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, all these amazing activists that spent their whole lives until they passed away, and I think passed the legacy, of their work to other younger activists.
Yeah, I'll build on that. Number one, remember that you are a human being. You're only a human being, and your health matters. Your well-being matters, because without your own health and well-being, you couldn't do the work. You couldn't continue to stay in the fight. So taking care of yourself is really important. And I learned that the hard way because I had a health crisis that forced me to slow down and really look at how was I engaging in the work in a way that was depleting myself to the point where I had a health crisis. So that's really important. Having a sense of humor is incredibly important in the work, I think, to be able to take a step back, find moments of humor. Yes, this is very serious stuff we're working on, but how do you find joy? How do you find joy in the community? How do you have fun? How do you engage in a way that makes you feel how you want to feel, connected, satisfied, finding meaning. And for me, I have found as I've gotten older, having some kind of my own spiritual practice, I meditate regularly, a way to connect with myself. Because a lot of the work you're constantly working with others, you're listening to the demands of others, you're trying to think about the needs of others. It's important to find time each day to connect with yourself, so that you stay grounded to your own inner voice, that inner knowing that you have, and then go back out there. But I think being connected with others in community, in close community, is also so important. Grace, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I know that you posed like a question to us about what we thought about the film, and I feel like at least young people I know, when we see like films or struggles from 20, 30, 40 years ago, and we're like, oh man, we're kind of dealing with same thing, but like different shape, or like different, it's like the same struggle, but different head. And I kind of felt like that, especially with like school stuff, like just like this year, the past 2 years have been so hard on our youth, with just the like school situation. Resources with COVID are really bad, and then on top of that, like the school building conditions have always been bad, and none of the problems have been sort of resolved. And then Chris mentioned pilots, and hearing the numbers about how Penn could be giving so much money to schools just makes me so angry every single time. I just get angry. But I feel like being young, I'm like, oh, I think it's the same struggle, but I also didn't live those, like, the 20 years difference. Like I can see what it was 20 years ago through this film and feel like it's the same, but I didn't actually see the change. So I'm curious to hear from the two of you what you felt watching, the film now and just reflecting back on it in these last few minutes. I'm curious if you have wisdom to share, or reflections or hopes or not hopes. I don't know. Happy to hold space for whatever.
Thanks for that, Grace. I love the question. And, I don't feel a single bit of demoralization watching the film, right? I think that the struggle is the struggle, but understand that we are facing a leviathan of a system. We are in the belly of the beast. They spend billions and billions of dollars smacking us around every day, every moment of every day. And for me, to be able to keep the fight, keep to the fight, is enough, right? And don't worry, you didn't live the past 20 years, but you're gonna live the next 20 years, Grace. And I promise you, you can have a huge impact and a difference on those 20 years, and in the choice that you make in terms of fighting, right? And to me, again, um, you know, like the struggle now is this voter suppression, right? And the changing faces of white supremacy, right? So I recently read that by 2024, the United States will be the first highly developed country that will be minority. The minorities will be white, right? That there will be a majority of people of color. But you know why white people aren't, or white supremacists isn't worried about this shit, this stuff? Sorry, is because really they have reinvented white supremacy. They have taken large swaths of people of color into white supremacy. So white supremacy doesn't even need white people to operate, and white supremacy doesn't even need white supremacists to operate. Right? There are people of color, Asians. You know, I'll speak for myself in terms of the Vietnamese community. How many people are kind of caught up in the association with whiteness, right? Because they feel a sense of power. To me, that they have changed the they have drawn different lines, right? Every time we make progress. So people will ask me, "Have you seen progress?" So I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely. We've had progress," but they also really tried to redraw that line every time that we make progress. And to me, if I gave up now, if any of us give up now, well, it's over. But you can't. I ain't giving up, right? I will. I don't know. I don't know how long I'll live, but I'll probably be on my deathbed, shouting down white supremacy and capitalism.
I'm sure you will. I would say quickly for me, I saw progress in the film. I think, what I alluded to before about, it took 20 years to get rid of the SRC, and we got rid of it. The call for abolition is a more mainstream. It's in the mainstream discourse now around prison reform or prison abolition. I mean, that was such a radical thing back then. And I would just say, for me, the most meaningful work that I have done is all the work that I've done with younger people than myself in terms of mentorship, exposure to new ideas, leadership development, politicization. That work will outlive me. So I think investment in younger people, investment in youth is a critical piece of the continuing evolution of this work. So that's my answer to your question. And that also brings us to the end of this beautiful panel. Thank you all so much for participating and for all the work that you are doing and have done. I want to thank Toy Nguyen, Pep Marie, Christopher Rogers, and Grace Fan for being a part of this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Pleasure meeting and seeing everybody.
Thank you for watching Evolution of the Fight, a Philly Stories panel. You can watch the film that inspired the conversation, A is for Anarchist, B is for Brown, on PhillyCam TV tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern and online at phillycam.org/PhilaStories. Tomorrow, February 18th, through to next Thursday, February 24th. You can find more information about the Philadelphia Stories retrospective and what is being featured on that page as well. Keep up with PhillyCam on social media at PhillyCam and tune in next month for another live panel discussion. Thank you.